Welcome to the SWEduActs teach-in on police brutality as a form of structural racism. I'd like to say that a teach-in is a general education forum on any kind of complicated issue, usually an issue involving current political affairs. The main difference between a teach-in and a seminar is the refusal to limit the discussion to a specific time frame or a strict academic scope. We are a group of social work educators from around the United States who came together to amplify how police brutality and structural racism are addressed in the curricula within our schools of social work. And I'm dedicating this talk to a black male social work professor colleague who's experienced the ills of what police brutality can do to a community, because I want social work students to know that police brutality touches our community too. And my colleague wants you all to know that all black social work faculty are not immune depending on their social histories and social locations. He wanted me to emphasize to you that the social work response to police brutality should be as real and serious as the brutality itself. So let us keep that in mind as we learn today. It's our ethical responsibility to empower ourselves to be on the front line of addressing police brutality and being courageous in confronting structural racism. So in the talk today, we have a set of learning objectives. We're going to be defining police brutality, doing a history of the ways in which police brutality is a form of structural racism. We'll do a little bit of a discussion on the prevalence of police brutality or how much it occurs. We'll touch on the theory about how it is caused. We'll talk about responses to this social ill, and we'll end by talking about action steps for social workers. So let's start with a definition. If we look at Amnesty International's guidance on this, we see that police brutality really is used to refer to human rights violations by police. And this can include beatings by police or racial abuse. It can include killings that are unlawful, torture, or even the indiscriminate use of riot control agents or people at protests, things like that. So I want to also touch on why it is that social workers need to focus on police brutality in particular. And I think we need to remember that people who experience police brutality, it is traumatic. It is life-altering to experience this. And of course, it is sometimes lethal. We know that police actions arguably are state-sanctioned forms of social control, and they very much impact our communities, as well as the communities of all our clients. And of course, there are almost 20,000 law enforcement agencies across the United States of America. So this is something that affects all of us. Now, we've all seen the many, many, many names of all the people who have died at the hands of policemen and policewomen. But what I want you to know is that police killings, police brutality is not something new. This poster, as it turns out, is actually from 1963 when there was a protest to end police brutality. But the truth is that this goes way back. It goes centuries back. And if we look at the origins of the U.S. police force, we can see that in the 1700s we saw that slave patrols were put together in the colonies, specifically in the Carolinas. And they're the roots of the current police system. They were focused on preserving the system of slavery. And then during the Reconstruction era, we know that sheriffs really functioned to enforce segregation and to disenfranchise people who were freed slaves. We know that in the 1800s, BIPOC folks were an early target of police, as were recent European immigrants. And so this was really a racialization of what police work looked like. This work has always been racialized. This has been documented in the literature. If we look in the early 1900s in Chicago, we know that 30%, almost a third of the killings of people by police involved black people, despite the fact that they only constituted 5% of that city's population. So there was a disproportionality present. And these problems were noted at the presidential level. There was even a commission on law observance and enforcement that was put together, who made a report that was entitled Lawlessness in Law Enforcement, and you can see a picture of that here. So this has been noticed back in the 1930s during the Depression era. And really in the 1960s, during the Civil Rights era, we saw absolutely pervasive violence in policing, and for communities of color, this was an everyday occurrence. We saw super aggressive dispersion tactics during protest marches of the 1960s. This picture is taken of teenagers who were at a civil rights march, for example. And of course, we have a very famous picture here of the future Congressman John Lewis in Selma, Alabama on Bloody Sunday. In this picture, he is being beaten by police and suffered a fractured skull. Jumping ahead a little bit, I want to talk to you about the power of video and of everyday bystander video that started to emerge in the early 90s when the beating of Mr. Rodney King was videotaped and shared with the public. Mr. King was beaten over 50 times, and we know that because this was videotaped and shared. And so this really changed the game in terms of the world having a view of what happened during police encounters. And we started to hear more about what happened to people of color, and especially to black men and black people at the hands of police. We heard about the sexual assault of Mr. Abner Louima in a Brooklyn, New York police precinct, for example. And then in the late 1990s, we heard that Amadou Diallo was shot 41 times in the South Bronx, and this was really emblematic of an overuse of force, for example, so that we began to see a narrative where there was some resistance. There'd always been resistance, but we began to see more of a, perhaps, a narrative in the dominant society media a little bit. Then in 2012, we saw another watershed moment when Trayvon Martin, 17 years old, was shot while walking home with, famously, a bag of Skittles. And this was a big protest around what was known as the Stand Your Ground law. And when his killer was acquitted, the Black Lives Matter movement was born. And this, of course, is a movement that is organized and is focused on building local power to intervene and address violence that is inflicted on black communities by both the state and vigilantes. And pictured here are Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who have become very famous and shepherded the movement. Then in 2014, the horror continues with Mr. Eric Garner, who was selling cigarettes on the street, and he was unarmed, but ended up dying. Made famous the words, "I can't breathe," when he was put into a hold that constricted his airways. This became a rallying cry of the movement, of the resistance movement, in communities of color and other communities as well, and remains a rallying cry for people who are opposed to the ways in which police act in problematic manners. Of course, Michael Brown, who was also an unarmed young person, 18 years old, died in 2014. This was a particularly egregious situation because his body was left on the ground for hours and ignited significant protest in Ferguson, Missouri, where he passed away. And there are many such stories. These are just a few of the stories that we're touching on here today. Also in 2014, we saw the death of an especially young victim, Tamir Rice, who was only 12 years old and was holding a toy gun when he was shot by police, who shot him within seconds of arriving on the scene, if you look at the video, without even investigating the situation. This was in Cleveland. And then we had Miss Sandra Bland, who died in custody after being pulled over for a very minor traffic stop and allegedly being assaultive to police officers, although that's debated. There was a settlement in her favor with her family later, and this case drew a lot of attention. For the first time, we were starting to hear more about women involved in situations, or at least we started to hear these stories rise up. And that really leads us to the Say Her Name movement or hashtag campaign that began around 2015 and was put forth in large part by the African American Policy Forum. There was a recognition that we needed to recognize that it wasn't just men who were dying at the hands of police, and especially not just black men, but also black women were dying. And so there was at first a vigil in memory of black women and girls killed by the police. And for the first time, family members of black women killed by the police came together from all across the country for a powerful vigil designed to draw attention to their loved ones' stories. So, for example, the family members of Alberta Spriel, Rekia Boyd, Chantel Davis, Shelley Frey, Kayla Moore, Kyam Livingston, Miriam Carey, Michelle Cousseau, and Tanisha Anderson all came together and were supported by hundreds of attendees, activists, and stakeholders. And this was followed by hashtag campaigns, a report that came out on this topic, and Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw's TED Talk, The Urgency of Intersectionality, where she highlighted the ways in which being both black and a woman function to erase, in some ways, people from being seen as being victims of police violence. So this started to raise the profile of this population as also being victims of police violence, although it still continues. Unfortunately, we continue the lament. In 2016, we lost Mr. Philando Castile, who worked in a school. He was completely compliant with police during his traffic stop, where he had his girlfriend or partner in the car with her baby in the back, but ended up being shot and bled out in the car. This was a particularly notable situation because it was all live streamed by his partner. And so again, we have the use of technology to push the movement forward in documenting these horrors. Move to this year, and we had the death of Miss Breonna Taylor, who was an EMT sleeping in her bed and shot 8 times as a result of a no-knock warrant being issued to her house. Nothing was found in her house. In fact, it may have even been the wrong house, as I understand it. And apparently the people that have been involved in this are still not brought to justice. And of course, we also had the death of Mr. George Floyd. And his death really represents a critical convergence of not only what happened to him, but what happened to him at the intersection of COVID and economic distress that launched a new civil rights movement. Just after the death of Mr. Floyd, we saw the death of Mr. Tony McDade, who was a transgender man in Tallahassee, Florida. And this death really represented the fact that we see overrepresentation of the death of transgender people. We know that transgender people are 3.7 times more likely to experience any kind of police violence and 7 times more likely to experience physical violence from police as opposed to cisgender victims. But this is even more powerful because BIPOC transgender people are 6 times more likely to experience physical violence from police than are white cisgender victims. And so that's important to sit with and lift up. This is a high risk community when it comes to police violence. I'd also like to lift up the fact that there's very little recognition of how the social identity of disability factors in here, but there is an important intersection with disability. The Ruderman Family Foundation has stepped up and taken a look at data from 2013 to 2015, looking at all the people that died at the hands of police during that time. And they found that depending on how you counted disability, between 30 and 50% of the people who died were actually disabled. Sandra Bland, Freddie Gray, these were people with disabilities, but we don't hear a lot about the disability identities of the people that died. So this is especially important for social workers, given that 1 in 4 people in this country have a disability, and social workers will likely come into contact with this population. So now I'd like to move on and talk about how we actually measure police brutality or count it, so that we can understand how it's documented. And we have to start by saying that this measurement really is a huge challenge according to the American Civil Liberties Union. We know that citizen complaints are often underreported. People don't believe that their reports are going to make a difference. But we know if we look at historical data, it appears that people of lower socioeconomic status appear to be at most risk, and that among citizen encounters, in population-based surveys, roughly 14% of those encounters result in complaints of abuse. That's from an early study in the 80s. The recommendations of what people can focus on when they look at their local data from their police departments is actually looking not at complaints, but looking at the times that police have had to discharge their weapons. They have to document each time there's a discharge, meaning a shooting. Also to look at physical force. There's also documents about that. And then to have a really good understanding of what the policies are around when a gun can be used, and also to count lawsuits and to understand the nature of those lawsuits, assuming they're public documents. And this orange underline will take you to a link to a document that helps you to understand how to look at data in your local area. So looking at a little bit of what we know with respect to the prevalence of police violence, this information is from the organization Mapping Police Violence, and it tells you a bit about what we know about how many police killings happened in the United States over this 7-year period. So you get a sense of the gravity of the situation. We also know that last year in 2019, we only had 27 days, just under a month, where police did not kill someone in our country. And we also found that if we start on the left-hand side of this slide, that black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people, and that they are 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed compared to white people. So those are some important things to unpack if we might have stereotypes about the black population. So now I'd like to move on and talk a little bit about the causes of police brutality, or at least what the theories say about that. My understanding is that there are 2 competing theories about how lethal force is used by police that have been documented in literature, and these are summed up as the threat hypothesis and the community violence hypothesis. Okay, so the threat hypothesis is basically explained by saying that racism is an influence on an interpersonal interaction by police and a community member, okay? Whereas the community violence hypothesis is the idea that the violence is a direct response to the high rates of crime that is violent in, say, a black community. Okay, so these are the competing ideas about what causes brutality. So also, traditional arguments about what causes police brutality often focus on implicit racial bias in individual officers, and the idea that the police brutality incidents that you see really represent what are called a few bad apples and don't represent the will of the larger police force. But that really ignores the fact that racism has been baked into the police system from the times of slavery, when we went from slave patrols into the racialized structure of the police system, which has been documented in the literature. So there's a tension between the few bad apples argument and the argument that the police system is based on structural racism, is structurally racist. And that's nobody's fault. That's how our society is built. So I'm not trying to disrespect anyone there. I'm just trying to look at this in a structural fashion. So we do have some newer research that's been published within the last 2 years that identifies particular pieces of structural racism at the state level and looks across the country. They created a state racism index looking at a number of different factors, and they did find a relationship or a correlation between racism within a state and the rate of unarmed black people being killed by police. And they determined that there's actually support for both theories of cause of police brutality. So there's a mixed picture. So what can we do about this? What are the responses to police brutality? Well, we know that some of the responses that have been discussed a lot have had limited to no success. There's been a lot of talk about the need for implicit bias training with police, and thus far it's been unconclusive according to the literature that I was able to review. We also know that diversifying the police force based on race and ethnicity has not been very successful thus far. Neither has the use of body cameras, and that on the existing research. This could change. We know that some of the things that appear to have promise are restricting the use of things like chokeholds and also the policies around shooting at moving vehicles. Also, and this has particular relevance for social workers, helping officers to support people with intensive training on working with folks with mental illness, as opposed to short training. So they talked about the national average is a 6-hour training on working with people with mental illness. Moving that to a 40-hour training can make a difference. And then the final area with promise is to demilitarize local police forces and to reduce the use of SWAT team military-like machinery and clothing and weaponry, things like that. So there are some other suggested responses to dealing with police brutality that I want to raise because they've been raised in our communities. One is to renegotiate the power of police union contracts so that there's more accountability available on the part of officers who were involved in these incidents. And this relates to the fact that there's something called qualified immunity for when a civilian dies at the hands of police, so it's hard to sue police for being responsible for a death, and we may need to take another look at that, is the argument. Others have said we need to begin or initiate a truth and reconciliation process for all the types of police abuses that have been experienced in our communities. Some have said we need to hire more police officers, that there's too much stress on the few that exist, while on the other hand, others have said we need to defund police departments by taking some funding away for certain aspects of police work. And that includes hiring social workers to replace certain functions in existing police structures, so putting them into police structures, while others in turn say we don't want to put social workers into existing police structures because that will not change the underlying oppressive culture of police systems that are structurally racist. So there's a lot of debate out there and a lot of controversy. So I encourage you to sit with all this information and think about the ways in which police brutality is a form of structural racism, and to think about the ways in which we as social workers can respond to this problem of police brutality on all levels, micro, meso, and macro. And finally, to think about what we've learned as social workers about alternative conflict and dispute resolution approaches that we can potentially foster to help people avoid police involvement in the types of hot situations we have in our agencies and in our communities. And finally, I'll leave you with some action steps. I encourage you to educate yourself about how police brutality gets made. This link to the Brooks article is a wonderful article that thoughtfully works through that. In terms of educating yourself, for the BIPOC folks in the audience, I would encourage you to tend to racial trauma that affects you and to foster your resiliency. For the white folks in the audience, don't ignore the problem of police brutality because you can stay in a bubble. Challenge yourself, step up. Speak up about what's happening in your community. Do consider investing in positive community supports and programs. For everybody, learn trauma-informed practices, especially for work and youth in urban communities or any community where we might see police involvement that could go in a negative direction. Do participate in anti-racism work in your organization and work for a better organizational culture. And absolutely engage in your own individual anti-racism work, looking at yourself and how your involvement in this white supremacist culture might impact this picture. Thank you very much.